started volunteering with Before Slavery when I was still a college student at Spelman in 2015. And then I went for study abroad. That's where in Switzerland, and that's where I met Dr. Zaugg, Roberto. During that time, Roberto was still translating the journal, and I was interviewing him on migration in Switzerland. Those were the days where there was the migration crisis in the Mediterranean, and I was doing a research paper on that as part of my program I was doing for my study abroad. And he mentioned that he was at the University of Lausanne, and he mentioned that he was translating a journal from West Africa, and which part of Africa I was. My accent gave away. So, and that's how I got to know about the journal. So when I heard Miss Pat talking about this project she's working on this year, I said, you know what, I know somebody who was translating a journal. So I would like to give a brief introduction on Dr. Zaugg, Roberto. Roberto is a professor of history, and he's heading a history department at the University of Zurich currently. And for the past 10 years, he has been translating the journal, and he has co-authored it with Dr. Craig. So Roberto, I would like to give this opportunity to you to give us more about yourself. Tell us more about yourself.
Thank you very much, Modester, for this very kind introduction. As you will hear, English is not my native language, so one must actually say that the actual translation is the work by my colleague Craig Koflosky. But let's say we have been, of course, working together on the edition.
Absolutely.
I must say, I'm originally not a specialist. I've not been trained back in my PhD as an Africanist historian. I've been working on European migration history, but then afterwards I was looking for a topic to connect European history to African history, and that's when I found, and later Craig found this journal, and we joined hands to work on it together, because we thought that it was an opportunity to bring this kind of topics into the history of Germany, but let's say European history more in general. I don't know, Craig, if you want to add something.
Well, let's go back to Modester, and you can introduce me, I think, and then I'll kind of take it from there. I think that's how we're going to.
Thank you. So just briefly as well, the co-author of the book is Dr. Craig Koflosky. I'll call him Craig. So Craig is a history professor as well at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And he's written several interesting titles and research, and been hosted on radios, talk shows, magazines, and has gotten several awards or recognition by even Longman. So he's a very renowned writer, and he's been focusing on European history, especially the history of everyday life. And right now, your research is, I'll give you the floor now. Otherwise, I'll finish everything. May you?
Thank you, Modester. It's really been a pleasure to work with you and to work with Pat, to be invited to talk about our work in the framework of Before Slavery. The book that I'm working on right now, the book that is not finished yet, is a book on the history of skin in the early modern period. Attitudes towards skin in the period from about 1450 to about 1750, from the time of European contact with Southern Africa and the New World through the height of Atlantic slavery. So in my book, I study attitudes towards skin color, racism in skin color. I also study cosmetics, tattooing, branding, blushing, all the different ways that the world learned how to understand skin and mark skin and label people through what was on their skin. And that's a big project. Talk about that some other time. That's a big project. We talk about that some other time. But as Roberto was saying, we've found this diary independently of one another, but we quickly realized we would be much better off working together. And I could never have translated it without the help of Roberto, because figuring out what our barber surgeon, Johann Peter Oettinger, was saying is not always that easy. You need a native speaker of the language to figure out what he's saying, and you need a native speaker of English to make it sound good to English readers. So we really had to work together. Roberto is too modest because, like many natives of Switzerland, he is fluent in English, French, Italian, and, well, where else are we there? English, French, and Italian for sure, right? So his linguistic skills are quite enormous. And German, of course.
That's interesting. Thank you. So I'm just curious, really, what, at first you said it started, you bumped into this journal and you started translating it and you were doing independent research, and I suppose it was going to be just a research publication. But what motivated you to turn this research into a book?
Well,
Craig,
we discovered that there's a lot in here that no one has ever seen before. First of all, when we got to look at this whole diary, which is a whole nother discussion in itself, we got to look at this whole diary, we realized we were looking at the only German language description of the entire triangle trade that's available for this period. In addition, Oettinger describes another voyage that he took from Amsterdam to Curacao, and then with a slave ship from Curacao to Suriname. So we said, this is already unique because there's no German language text like this. We quickly discovered it was a text full of crazy stories, adventure, and a lot of eyewitness descriptions of the really horrible but real activity that's involved in Atlantic slavery. So we realized we had a unique story, we had a vivid story, and then we began to realize that it tells us things about West Africa, what we call pre-colonial West Africa in the era of the slave trade, before there were permanent European colonies there, that was also unfamiliar to most people. So we realized there's a lot going on here, and that's why we decided to translate it into English and to publish it. We think it'll be great for college classes and college students, for example.
And I think it is also great to just add into the archives or the historical records of African history, because it is not widely researched compared to other continents, other history like South American history, European history. I think Africa has lesser recorded history accounts, especially firsthand and eyewitness history. So this is awesome. It is great. Thank you for your work and adding to this priceless account. And
you know, the more we look, the more we will find. If you a few years ago, I looked at a pie chart of historians in the United States by country that they study or by region that they study. So the biggest chunk of the pie is, of course, historians in the United States who study the history of the United States. Fair enough. Okay. European history, Latin American history are in there with maybe about 25% share. Asian history is close behind. And the single smallest category of historians working and teaching in the United States, based on the regional world they study, is Africa. That's a little sliver. 10%, I believe it is, of all the historians of all the colleges and universities in the United States are specialists on Africa. So to build on what you said, we don't even know how rare these records are, because we don't have enough historians studying the area and going out there and looking for them. It's easy to say that there's not much, but really until you've looked, you don't necessarily know. We found this really almost by accident.
Mhm. Right, and thank you so much for working on this topic. So, as you say, there's rare information and new insights that you came across in this journal. What kind of information was written in this journal that you haven't seen anywhere else?
Well, we have to go back to why it was written. Johann Peter Oettinger is a journeyman barber surgeon. So he's a journeyman. That means he's completed his apprenticeship, and he's required by German law and custom to travel from place to place and learn with different masters to improve his skills. He would have to do this if he were a journeyman shoemaker or a journeyman tailor or a journeyman goldsmith. But he's not any of those things. He's a journeyman barber surgeon. So he's a hands-on medical practitioner who shaves beards, trims hair, but also performs all kinds of surgical interventions or surgery on the body. And he describes sewing up people's wounds and injuries, removing growths and tumors and things, all kinds of work like that. As a journeyman, he wants to be promoted to be a master. So this journal that he kept was kind of like his college transcript. This was a record of everywhere he went and all of the work that he did as a barber surgeon as proof that he had learned a lot. So he keeps track of the masters he works with in Germany and in the Netherlands, including several women who are widows of barber surgeons, but they're his boss. They're in charge of him. He's a journeyman working with them. And then he records his 2 trips into the Atlantic world, and with more detail than he would really have to. But I think we're also fascinated with the information he recorded because he's writing for a German audience, and they're less familiar with the ways of the Atlantic world, Atlantic slavery, judging people in racial terms. They're less familiar with that than people in England or the Netherlands or Spain or Portugal that are more involved with the Atlantic world. So we think he describes things in a little bit more detail because he's thinking of an audience that is far away from the Atlantic Ocean, maybe has never seen a person of African origin or very rarely, and he wants to describe that to show that what he did was real. So that's what he writes. The information he keeps in there is about how he invested in the slave trade. He bought cotton and tobacco and sugar when he was in the West Indies in the Virgin Islands and tried to ship it back to make money. He describes all aspects of this world.
So the insights that it gives is giving insights into the new world to the German audience. But as we read it now in 2020, is giving us also an insight of how he viewed Africans at first contact, or even the people that he met, the French that he met during his journeys, the accounts, and he gives them in that eyewitness accounts the pure first-hand information, and that enables us to judge the situation, how people thought, how they felt during those days, or if they felt anything at all about the slave business.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. He doesn't have any he doesn't have any moral position on the slave trade like most people. Almost every single person who was asked about it, obviously the slaves had a position on the slave trade. They didn't want to be enslaved, but he doesn't condemn it or justify it. It's just a part of his reality. The very worst people, one of the things we discover from this book, is Oettinger's opinion, the very worst people in the world are the French people. We cannot stress this enough. Wherever you go, from ordinary French people to Louis XIV, King of France, they are treacherous, devious. They're bad surgeons who kill their patients instead of curing them. They're irresponsible and deceitful. They are the worst people in the world. They are uniformly bad.
Wow.
That's the things you learn. His perspective on Africans is much more nuanced, and he kind of takes it as he sees it. He talks about kings. He talks about merchants, local rulers, people who try to rebel and resist capture. So it's a broad spectrum.
So you mentioned Africans. So when you mention African people that he talks about, which African people and polities did Ottinger encounter during the voyage? And what was the political organization of these polities and the role that they played in the slave business? Maybe Roberto, you may answer that.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean the ship, this Brandenburg, this German ship on which he sails along the west coast of Africa, actually makes a long journey from modern day Mauritania until Gabon. And
Do you have maps on that?
I have a map.
Maybe if you can please pull it up so we can have a visual. Thank you. As Roberto maybe talks and you pull it up.
If you can activate my screen sharing, then I can share this map. I just sketched out a map. Roberto hasn't even seen this map. It's very crude. I just sketched it out.
Excellent.
Great.
Let me see if I can. Ah, there we go. Okay, and let me just
perfect. Yeah, that. Oops.
Okay.
Excellent. So
there it is. You see that?
You see the first. You see the first red dot on the West African coast, Arguin. That's actually the first stop the ship makes on the coast of West Africa, and there they meet a very diverse society because I mean we are in the territory of modern day Mauritania, which at the time was the Emirate of Trarza, a polity ruled by Arab Berber emirs, rulers. But at the same time, the society of the Emirate of Trarza was much more diverse, was not uniquely Arab Berber. You had actually also Black Africans. Some of these Black Africans were actually autochthonous people like the Imragan from the coastal area, often fishermen. But also you had also Black Africans who were descendants of enslaved people who had been deported by the Arab Berbers from further south, from the territory of modern day Senegal. So this is the first polity, an emirate with Islamic law. And then he moves further south. They have a first stop actually in the estuary of the Sierra Leone River. Yeah, somewhere there, where they meet with a completely different society. They meet with the Temne people, who are actually not at all organized into a large territorial state, but rather in autonomous village societies, and which actually in this period they have a rather, let's say, indirect role in the slave trade. That is, they don't sell so much enslaved people, but they rather sell fresh water provisions and food provisions to the slave ships who passed there. And then they go on, they sail on, they arrive in the southwest of modern day Ghana on the so-called Gold Coast, in a territory inhabited by the Akan people. There as well, no big monarchies, no territorial states, no large territorial states, but rather territories ruled through alliances between rather autonomous settlements. So this is before the expansion, the 18th century expansion of the Ashanti Empire, which then creates actually a larger states. But in this period, in the late 17th century, still very small autonomous polities. And the period of the late 17th century on the Gold Coast and in the Akan world is a period of transition, because as the name Gold Coast says, for a very long time, the main exports was gold dust. But in the late 17th century, slaves are becoming rapidly more and more important. So it's also a slave exporting region. But then the most important region on this behalf is exactly, you see it on the map, it's in written Slave Coast. It's the coastal area of modern day Republic of Benin. And there really Oettinger goes on land, and he steps into an actual monarchy in the kingdom of Hueda, inhabited by Gbe-speaking people, ruled by a king who is getting really rich through a thriving slave export economy. And it's also the region which is the cradle of Vodou, the voodoo religion. So it's, again, a very different society. So one can say that this voyage along the coast of West Africa brings this young German craftsman into contact with very diverse African societies. And he is aware of that diversity, but at the same time, he struggles to make sense of it and to describe it with proper terms.
Right. Right. Thank you. Wow.
We can come back to that slide. We'll show you his whole triangle journey at some point, but for the focus on West Africa and the life of people before slavery, that's the route that he sees. I think I can show you another image of everywhere he stops on the coast, but in the meantime, go on and with your other question.
So what was interesting was that important part by the Bight of Benin, where you say the king and his elites really made a lot of profits in capturing slaves. That at first they were trading in gold and ivory and all these merchandise, but in the end, slaves became captive people, became more valuable than gold. And it's such a gruesome thing to think that they were commodified and the king actually profiteered to the extent of even selling sick and frail people to these ships. So may you please give us more information about the condition of the slaves? What were the captives like when they boarded the ships, and what did the surgeon observe about them health-wise, and how did he participate? Because that was his main job, to safeguard or make sure that the commodity makes it through the Middle Passage. So may you expand more on that?
Yeah, so Modesto, you couldn't have put it better. The Atlantic slave trade is commodity capitalism, just like any other kind of commodity capitalism. So the product has to be inspected and standardized. There's a standard unit for the measure of one healthy male slave. That's two women. A woman is equal to like 3/4 of one healthy male slave. Enslaved African child is 1/4. So there's a standardized unit of measurement. It's called by a Spanish word, although the Spanish don't have much to do with it. It's called the pièce d'homme, I guess would be the one way to pronounce it, which is to say, so you could count up the number of enslaved Africans in a voyage, but you could also convert that to how much that was equivalent to in healthy, young, able-bodied slave men. So that's a unit of commodification. Figuring out who's able-bodied is indeed the job of the surgeons on the slave ships. Their job is to keep everybody alive, the crew, the enslaved people, everybody. And so they take the enslaved people usually someplace where the light is good, out on the beach, just like buying any other commodity. They have to be inspected carefully. And we know this from English accounts, we know this from Oettinger's account. The African dealers of the slaves want to sell them all. So they conceal any possible defects with them. We're told that the slaves' heads are shaved so that it's not possible to see if they have gray hair and judge their age. Their bodies are oiled down to look healthy and shiny. And the whole idea is to make this human merchandise look as high quality as possible. men like Oettinger participate in the slave trade because they inspect that merchandise. And it's so repugnant even to them. It's such a violation of human dignity that they hesitate, but do describe that they have to inspect the genitalia of all of the enslaved people to make sure they don't have a venereal disease, which would spread among the enslaved people and reduce their value. So the worst physical inspection you can imagine of a human body, Oettinger is doing it. And they purchase, inspect, and brand about 600-700 captives in Quetta, and load them onto the ship there. And there are other people on the ship doing some of the inspecting, but he is largely responsible for that. So it's just a nightmare. It's just an affront.
So we haven't gone through this horrific process of physical inspection. Did Oettinger mention their mental disposition after they had boarded the ships? Like, for example, I can imagine you'd be stressed, but did he mention that? Was it something that he was thinking about?
Oettinger doesn't even mention his own mental disposition. So he's not real in touch with himself and his own feelings, nor with anybody else's. But 17th century people have a little bit different idea of what they're supposed to think about it and what they're supposed to do. We do have evidence of some of the subtle psychological toll that being enslaved took on Africans. There's another source that historians use to understand enslaved people in the New World, and these are newspaper advertisements posted by slave owners and slave masters who are seeking self-liberated slaves, or so-called runaway slaves. We call them fugitives from slavery, self-liberated slaves, self-emancipated slaves. The masters called them runaway slaves because in the master's minds, that's what they were, runaway property. And these newspaper advertisements describe the runaway individual: height, weight, skin tone, traditional African marks on their skin, brands from the enslavers on their skin, scars from injuries. They also discuss what languages these enslaved people can speak. And a colleague of ours in Scotland has noticed that a disproportionately large number of these ads reference enslaved Africans who can speak, but with a stammer or a stutter.
Wow.
So they're not native speakers of English. They've learned to speak English as part of being enslaved in the English-speaking world, but it's reported not that they speak it with difficulty or something like that, but that they can speak it, but with a stammer or a stutter. And one could imagine that that is evidence of some of the psychic toll that enslavement took on people. That topic remains to be studied more. That's really on the cutting edge of understanding the enslaved experience. But I know a scholar in Scotland who has commented on that before. So there's the other aspects of it. We come to a transition from mental disturbance to resistance, and that is in the well-known act of slave suicides.
Wow.
You understand this as an act of despair or as an act of resistance, a refusal to be transported away from Africa, a refusal to be reduced to a commodity.
And in the book, there are accounts of resistance. And can you talk briefly about that? Because not too much, but briefly, because we also want the participants to be curious enough to buy the book and read for themselves, because it's an interesting book, right? Oh. But briefly, are there any accounts, and how does Oettinger describe these accounts?
Roberto and I were talking about this. This is on the African side of the story. Well, the first part of it is. So I'm going to turn this over to Roberto. He's more of our expert on the African side of it.
Well, okay. I think there are different types of resistance with I mean, very subtle forms of resistance, like refusing to eat. For example, just passively refusing to cooperate with the enslavement, attempts, as Craig has mentioned, of suiciding, and some of these actually succeed. We have people who throw themselves in the water during the Middle Passage. We have persons who try to escape. both during the Middle Passage, both when the ship is still anchoring in front of the African coast, but of course also in the Caribbean. There is marooning, so slaves who escape from the plantations and try to build independent communities in the hills and the woods.
Wow.
And there is one case in the narrative by Johann Peter Oettinger, which is highly interesting because it's the case of a Akan man who is described as a kind of a chief, of a person who belonged to the elite on the Gold Coast, but who must have been involved in some kind of political conflict in his homeland, and thus was sold into slavery. He then tries to buy his own freedom because he has relatives who are available to pay gold to free him, but they refuse it. So really, you see, they want to get rid of him. And then on the ship, once he's on the ship, he takes a leadership role, and he tries to organize a mutiny, a slave rebellion on the ship. But this plan is then discovered, and he's captured and executed. So it's very, very dramatic, and of course we have not the complete information on this person, but you clearly see that he's playing a leadership role.
And you can also notice the sophistication, because back then, most people today have this narrative that there was lack of leadership. They were not, Africans could not organize themselves. You would have very few people who are brave and courageous like that. But he himself managed to organize rebellion and even almost succeeded. But he spoke a different language. Of course, he was a leader, and he caused a lot of trouble. So he was a person who was very intellectual. The standard, I can assume that given the standards of that time, he was intellectual and smart enough and had very high leadership qualities to be able to do all of that and be able to outsmart even the slavers on the ship, I assume.
And this is one example, and this is one example.
Yeah, exactly. This is one example that we found out about. He is certainly the African individual who is described in the most detail by Oettinger, with the possible exception of King Anbangla in Hueda. But he's the person who's described in the most detail, so he definitely left an impression on Oettinger. We don't know his name, but Oettinger doesn't record a lot of names in any case. But we know he was Akan. If he was going to lead any kind of a successful revolt on board the ship, he would have had to cross languages and cultures to talk to the Gabay-speaking people, who were the majority of the enslaved people who were brought on in the Bight of Benin. And it looks like he was pretty close to doing that. His rebellion was betrayed by other enslaved men on board, who ratted him out to the crew of Oettinger's ship. And that's when that rebellion came to an end. And where were they, Oettinger, by that time? Roberto, they were pretty far south, right?
Off the coast of Gabon, I think.
Yeah, off the coast of Gabon. So he's already hundreds of miles from his homeland, but organizing this possibility of a mutiny. And of course, the percentage of slave voyages across the Middle Passage that didn't have some kind of mutiny are very low. There was constant rebellion and constant resistance at all levels. And you can tell when these ships leave Europe, they have more men on them than other merchant vessels. They have more weapons on them. Of course, they're equipped with shackles and things like that. So the slave traders, they know that people are going to try to kill themselves to get out of this. They know that they have to use brute force and lock the captives down. This is all part and parcel of this European business.
Right. And that also evidences that people knew what they were doing. They were not weaklings. They were not people who were helpless, but they were actually people who knew what they were doing. Probably they were overpowered. Probably they were disempowered. However, they were smart and courageous people. And that point, that's also give us an idea of where they came from. They came from sophisticated societies, and they were not just like animals that were captured roaming around the bushes of Africa, you know, of whatever areas that they lived in. You know.
Well, I mean, the whole movement of enslaved people across Africa from one part of Africa to another is not a morally great thing, but it's a testament to the sophistication and the commercial focus of West Africa at this time. This was not I mean, we're talking about 10, 11 million people, let's say 10 million just from West Africa who were moved across the Atlantic. That's a massive undertaking on the African side and on the European side. That's not something that just happens when a few people are just captured and dragged onto a ship. It's much worse.
Right. Oh, that's right. So I would like to take you back on the cultures and customs of the West African people. So does the journal mention any medical knowledge that the enslaved people had or they exhibited on the ships, or was there any mention of that?
Not directly. Oetting is, unfortunately, he's very silent on that behalf. But we know from other sources and from scholarship, which has been done on this behalf, that of course, I mean, there were West African concepts of health, healing, and disease. There are cases which have been studied who show how to say, the sensitiveness towards the therapeutical function of plants, knowledge about plants, and even when the deported Africans were in a new environment in the Americas, the tendency to seek to learn actively about the new plants they were encountering. Also, what we have learned is that concepts about healing and health are neatly connected with concepts about religion, because disease, be it mental or physical, is often conceptualized as the result of a malevolent intervention of a spirit or a deity. So healing also is considered as a process of pushing back such metaphysical forces, or to gain the benevolence of such metaphysical forces. There's a very good book by a historian, James Sweet, who has actually shown that healers were also religious leaders, and so these two spheres are not separate, but they're actually connected.
Wow. So as you said, healers were also so did the enslaved and the tribes on the coast seem to have doctors among them, and did they provide any treatment to the slavers who got sick on the African continent? For example, we have a lot of example in American history of Native Americans trying to befriend and care for the sick colonialists or settlers.
I would say probably I would not define them as doctors, because doctor kind of evokes academically trained specialists who do only physical healing. As I said, it's more a combined profession of both religious and healing, I would say. Now, I'm personally not aware, I've never come across personally on sources relating that such healers like voodoo priests are on the west coast of Africa are providing healthcare to European slavers. But what of course is very important is the role of women. the slave traders who the European slave traders who lived and worked on the coasts of West Africa mostly entered temporary relationships with African women who became practically their wives, and they probably they would not have many of those traders would not have survived without the support of these women, because I mean Europeans were extremely vulnerable to
and
tropical
it was a
disease.
harsh life. It was a harsh life as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You know, it's an interesting question, Marty. I also have not seen anything where there's any account of any Europeans who get any kind of healing in West Africa. But because of what Roberto just explained, which is that for the West Africans, physical and spiritual healing are pretty closely aligned, a lot of these Europeans are going to be very afraid to approach something which to them might look like they're leaving the boundaries of Christianity behind, and they're relying on supernatural and diabolical forces. They'd be afraid to do that in Europe at home, to go to a wise woman for healing. That's unchristian. You're not allowed to do that. They'd be even more afraid to do it in West Africa. But oddly enough, once they've removed these Africans from their native land and brought them to the New World, then there's actually a lot of evidence of Europeans resorting to enslaved Africans for healing in the New World. And as I said at the start, we were talking about this before, the more you look, the more you find. It's like anything else. So in our book on Oettinger, we also have sources from 4 other travelers and observers of African and Caribbean life to kind of round out or give some basis for comparison. One of them is a French priest named Labat, French Dominican priest, Père Labat. And no sooner does he get to Guadeloupe than he's plagued by all these tick bites. And he immediately goes to an enslaved African woman there who gives him a cure for these tick bites that relieves that. Another, and once again, I don't know how often this happens, but another famous European in the Caribbean is Sir Hans Sloane. He's the founder of the British Museum. His collection becomes the basis of the British Museum. When Sloane's a physician himself, when Sloane's in Jamaica, he has a toe infection, a toe ailment. He can't cure it. He goes to a native woman, and he manages to report that the woman, that the enslaved African woman cured his toe, and also to dismiss the knowledge of enslaved people and native people there as being very medically limited. He manages to get both of those into one account. That's in his description of Jamaica. So, and as Roberto pointed out, this indicates a willingness to combine knowledge of healing and healing plants in Africa with same plants or different plants in the New World. And in the case of Guadeloupe, Martinique, Dominica, to take on some native Caribbean knowledge as well. That's where this stuff all starts to mix.
Right. So as you were talking about religion and how it is connected to the healers, that healers were also religious practitioners, was there any mention of a supreme being on the West African coast, or a description of their way of worship? And if there were any similarities with other religions that you have noted in your study as historians?
Yes, I mean,
this is tricky. Go ahead, Roberto. This is tricky.
I mean, he there again, he meets very diverse African societies during his journey. He meets, of course, in Mauritania, Sunni Islam, especially the Sunni Islam of the Maliki school. And he on the island of
the Maliki school. I'm sorry, Maliki school.
Maliki school. So it's the predominant current of Sunni Islam in Western Africa, also in North Africa, with the exception of Egypt. He meets of course Catholicism on the island of São Tomé, which was a Portuguese colony, and also the see of one of the 3 bishopric of the Catholic Church south of the Sahara. He meets Catholic priests, black Catholic priests,
Okay.
and he's very uncomfortable. He's highly uncomfortable about that. And the astonishing thing for Craig and me when we read that is that what he is more like uncomfortable about, it's not even because these are black priests, but because they're Catholic. And Oettinger is the son of a Lutheran pastor. So in the 17th century, they're not on good terms.
And he's on an island too. I think that freaks him out even more.
Yeah.
He travels through Catholic territories in Germany, but he's always kind of, moving on. He feels like he's sort of get away if things get crazy.
Wow.
But he's on the island of Sao Tome. It's a Portuguese territory, and he's surrounded, in his mind, by these Catholic priests. Roberto's research shows that it seems like there were actually only 2 or 3 actual Catholic priests on the island when
the Capuchin missionaries.
Yeah,
yes.
the Capuchin missionaries were there. But in Oettinger's mind, he's surrounded by them. And he just writes, he doesn't show a lot of his own emotion, but he's so happy to get off the island, so happy to be back on the ship. And, that's a surprising thing to say, because he knows when he's getting on the ship in Sao Tome, the next stop is America. So he's getting on the ship for this long, scary transatlantic voyage, this middle passage. But he's still relieved to get away from the Catholic priests in Sao Tome. He's afraid they're going to hex him or something, I think.
Wow.
And then I mean, of course, there are what Europeans in that time defined as heathens, pagans, that is polytheistic religions, also very diverse. And of course, the most striking polytheistic culture Oettinger encounters on the coast of West Africa is Vodou, the religion which you have in the Bight of Benin, and which is of course also the source of those more syncretistic religions in the Americas. Voodoo in Louisiana and the Caribbean, Santeria in Cuba, Candomblé in Brazil. So a religious system formed by a multiplicity of deities and worshipping deities, worshipping ancestral spirits in the attempt to establish a reciprocal relation with these metaphysical forces. So there are sacrificial offerings given to these deities in expectations that these deities will then intervene in a favorable way for the living people. Now, in this context, is there a supreme being? And there is one single passage by Oettinger who says yes. Now, this passage, Oettinger has copied it from another travelogue written by a German Lutheran pastor who was on the Gold Coast. And he actually mentions the Akan idea of a creator god, Nyankopon. And so, yes, in polytheistic contexts of the West African coast, there are concepts of creator deities. Now, does this mean that these creator deities were seen as supreme deities? This is a big debate among scholars. Yeah. Some claim that yes, it was the case. I'm not a big specialist in that, but I would rather say that this is a very Christian interpretation. Right. In my view, there were creator deities, but these were deities among other deities. They did not have necessarily a supreme God status. But it's a question which is open to debate.
It is a question that is open to research as well, yes. Because I think the fact that the Lutheran pastor, even for the short time that he lived on the coast, managed to identify that within the culture they had a supreme being in spite of having many other deities. That means they were some kind of, he had an understanding of the religions or whatever way of worship that the people had. They had But as you said, it's an area that's open to debate, and also more research will be needed on that.
Yeah.
So moving on to agriculture, food and diet, this is an area that we are really interested in, because the enslaved people in the first place, the reason why they were enslaved was because they were resistant to a lot of diseases in the New World. They were stronger than, they were strong to be able to perform the labor-intensive work in the islands and plantations. So there must have been something not only in their DNA, but also the diet that they were used to on the African coast that made them very probably immune, I don't know, or strong. So is there anything that hints to that, that confirms that, or that actually negates that? I don't want to assert any because I'm not an expert, but it's just trying to understand why they were stronger and infer that it might have been because of their diet or their agriculture. What?
Well, this is highly debated too, and one of the best and worst things about studying history is that history never tells you quite what you think or what you want to believe. So there's a counter argument by historians of New World slavery about the disease resistance of Africans, which has a very simple and depressing conclusion, which is that Africans were no more resistant to tropical diseases in the New World than Europeans. It's simply that Europeans were more willing to let Africans die in the New World than they were willing to have their own people die in the New World. That seems to be another way of looking at it. So it's not, historians are not in agreement on whether there was any kind of biological difference or advantage. I think if you go back to West Africa, yes, the Europeans who get there, they just drop like flies. You know, they just die at an incredible rate. They all, what they call land sickness is probably malaria. And the minute they get off the ships and come in to land, Oettinger even describes just being swarmed with these little biting insects, which he calls mosquitoes. And you read this and you think, oh my God, you know, it
was terrible.
He's doomed. All these guys are doomed. Malaria, yellow fever, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea, taking that in reverse and saying, well, the Africans are more resistant to disease, so they're going to survive better than tropical climates. People in the period of slavery definitely said that and thought that. We don't believe most of what they say or think. So historians are now making a different argument. I think it's still up for debate as to whether they were physically more resistant or whether it was just that their labor was literally cheaper and their lives were less valued. That's really the thing we have to face up to.
Interesting. So that's very interesting. So in the book, Roberto, on the African coast, is there any agricultural methods, any foods that are mentioned that were being consumed by the local people on the coast?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, because the diet also for the European crew on the diet on board must have been very monotonous. And so one thing which he is always interested in is what kind of food you can get on the coast, just to vary the diet. And of course, I mean, the coasts of West Africa, there again, we can reconstruct this partially from the narrative of Oettinger or through other sources, but there are a multiplicity of agricultural settings. You have, of course, in the dry Sahel, so Mauritania, northern Senegal, you have cereals like sorghum, millet, which are consumed, but also, of course, fishing. Turtles are fished and eaten, or something Oettinger is enthusiastic about.
Turtle meat is delicious.
Yeah,
Loves
exactly.
the turtles.
And antelopes they chase antelopes. Further south, like in Gambia, southern Senegal, modern day Guinea-Bissau, there is rice cultivation. I mean, rice has been a typical kind of
It's
rice
22 hours.
has been domesticated already 3,000 years ago in the wetlands of the Niger River in Mali, and then spread to more coastal areas. There is, of course, in the tropical rainforest area of the Gold Coast and the Bight of Benin, yam, which is a very important staple food in that region. And then, of course, one must say, there are also new plants coming in. American plants were coming in, maize, is corn, cassava, and sweet potatoes. And it's for me as a European historian, it's fascinating to see, because maize is very much seen in, for example, in northern Italy, where part of my family comes from. It's really seen as something autochthonous. But if I look at the historical data, you see that actually, well, of course, we know that maize comes from the Americas, but not only. West African societies have been faster in adopting maize than Italians, for example. So also on that level, on the level of food and agriculture, the West African societies are really entangled in processes of globalization in these decades.
Wow.
I love tobacco, like everybody does everywhere around the world. Yeah. So New World tobacco is a very popular trade good in West Africa. Yeah. But you know what we in this hemisphere call corn, which we call American corn or maize, that shows up all over the place in Oettinger's account. And indeed, there are little African economies that are devoted to growing corn to sell to slave trading ships for food for the Middle Passage. At one point, Oettinger talks about a huge kettle being mounted on the deck of his ship because they're getting ready to take on their huge load of
Right. I wanted to also ask, so what kind of foods did they load on the ships to feed the crew, to feed 700 people? You know, how many barrels of water, fresh water would they need?
You know, they talk about feeding the enslaved captives a lot of beans and grains. There's not really a lot of detail. Whatever it is, it was cooked in a huge kettle that was like cemented onto the deck of the ship. After they get to Africa, they don't bother to put that kettle in on the trip down from Europe because they're not feeding that many people. But when where they're going to take on these slaves and then commence the Middle Passage, they prepare to serve food in these mass terms.
Wow. So thank you so much for that for that account. Now we have to move on to questions from our participants and attendees. We're going to open our Q&A.
Wonderful. Please do that.
So I think there's one person who raised their hand. They can talk, right? I'm going to allow them to. All right. Magnus, welcome to our panel. You may please ask your question.
That would be me?
Yes.
Magnus Bessel.
Yeah, hi there. I did not raise my hand, but I do have a question. So it's
okay.
That's good.
Can we see you, please?
I try. Wait a moment. No, it doesn't work. I have no options here. Okay. I'm sorry. I do not have that that option here. It's pretty restricted, but at least you hear me.
Very clear.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking a bit about all these political backgrounds at the time. I mean, if I look at the map, he goes to Friedrichsburg, and he's obviously he departs from Emden, and Emden, of course, is the great partner of the Brandenburgers. Mm-hmm. So, and we all know that at that age there was let's say a huge bickering between the Danes and the British, or not even the British, the English, the Brandenburgers, and how much is that present? This, let's say, entire geopolitical context.
Oh, it shapes Oettinger's whole life as a journeyman, because his life as a journeyman in Europe, in the Caribbean, in Africa, back to the Caribbean, it's all shaped by the War of the League of Augsburg, which we also call the 9 Years' War. I think it has 2 or 3 other names. And that's one of the reasons why he thinks the French are the worst people in the world, because he is identified, he's either on a Dutch ship or a Brandenburg-Prussian ship, and in either case, those political units are at war with the Kingdom of France, so he's always involved in hostilities from the French. So that shapes everything that's going on. His first trip to the Caribbean, they show up in Suriname, they discover that they're under attack by the French, war has broken out, and then on the last leg of his triangle journey, if I can show you that, the ship that he's been on, the ship we've been talking about all through this, all through this presentation, is captured by the French and then burned to the waterline. Let me see if I can find that. By the French when they seize the cargo. So let me see. Why can't I get that share? Let's see. No, that's not what I want to share. Go on. I'll find that in a moment. Roberto, you know more about this than I do, I think.
Sorry, what was?
You know more about the war of the League of Augsburg, the 9 Years' War, than I do. But those political things, they shape everything he does.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, and it's also, I think, a reason why his anti-Catholic feelings are so pronounced, because, of course, the Catholics, especially the Catholic Kingdom of France, in these years is the enemy, and it's an enemy whom he faces twice. He faces the French privateers in Suriname, has a naval fight there, and then on his second voyage, they're captured by the French. Yeah, the Dutch. There, I mean, the relation with the Dutch, it's actually. It's very a relation of affinity, because many of the crew members are actually Dutch. The captain is a Dutchman, is probably of Huguenot descent. So there is not really a distinction. It's very porous. Porous border between Germans and Dutch in the perceptions of Oettinger. I don't know if this question answers your question.
Magnus, if you can see this quick map that we put together here, so he's in Emden, right? And they want to sail to West Africa. They're so concerned about French ships patrolling the English Channel that to get from Emden to West Africa, they sail north around northern Scotland. They're like halfway to the Arctic Circle at this point, but that is safer for them than going here through the English Channel. So they make this unbelievable loop into the North Atlantic and come down here. They do their horrific business in Africa. They offload the slaves here in St. Thomas, state part of the U.S. Virgin Islands. Then they begin the return passage loaded with sugar, cotton, ginger, tobacco. And right around here, I think, we could be a little more accurate if we looked at another map, Oettinger's ship is attacked by a French convoy. They're all hauled off the ship. Some of their cargo is seized. Oettinger loses all of the cargo he bought, and then their ship is burned to the waterline. Then the French bring them to Brest over here in Western France, and then they are all let go. And then Oettinger walks from Brest across northern France and the Netherlands to Emden to collect his pay from the Brandenburg Africa Company that hired him. He does this in the winter of 1693, 1694. It's an amazing story. It's one of the coldest winters on record. And he just walks along here, hating the French every step of the way here as he passes through France and ultimately gets back there. So his whole life is shaped by these European political conflicts. But this slave trade is a huge inter-imperial competition, and he just gets caught up in it, I guess, put it that way.
Right.
I've seen we have a question by Mauro in the F&A.
So the question goes, thank you, Craig and Roberto. I want to follow up on one of the points you made. How does the surgeon perceive the difference between Muslim slaves and non-Muslim slaves? And if you have traced that the Muslim slaves, if they were any, themselves found some kind of comradeship along religious lines?
I've just found there is actually, it's a good question. have found the passage in the narrative where it describes these African Muslims. Now, just to answer the first part of the question, they don't have Muslim slaves on board. I mean, they stop in Mauritania, which is a society which has slaves, but they don't buy slaves there. They buy other stuff like ostrich feathers and gum arabic. But the interesting thing is that actually Oettinger notices, although he struggles to make sense of it, but he notices that there is a distinction between Muslim and non-Muslim Africans. And what he writes is very interesting. He writes on behalf of the stay in Arguin, on the morning of the 13th, the boat came from Arguin with the clerk corporal and 2 Tatars and Moors. They had 5 Moors with them who had great beards, unlike the other Moors. Clearly the distinction between Muslim and non-Muslim Africans. And they looked not unlike Jews. They hold the Mahometan faith, eat no pork, and drink neither wine nor brandy. They had with them a boy 5 or 6 years old with a fine bearing. But then he goes on, our ship was made spick and span for their visit.
Yeah,
so clearly these are the representatives of the Emir of Trarza.
Yeah, and so, I mean, Oettinger's struggling to make sense of the different kinds of people he meets in Africa, and then we struggle to make sense of what Oettinger wrote about that. But, you know, a couple of things are clear. For him, initially, I think there's really just one word, Moors. And that's people who are in some combination, either dark-skinned or Muslim, but not necessarily both. That's just this kind of huge category. Then he's got Tatarans or Tartarans, which is completely divorced from any geographic reality. And that seems to be sort of a word maybe for like lighter skinned Muslims, maybe, or maybe it's a synonym for Turks or something. We're not entirely clear on that. It's not until he's sailing down the coast of West Africa that he encounters 2 new words that he learns from the Dutch on the ship that he writes in Dutch in his journal. Those words are white and black. He says, we wanted to trade with these people, but they wouldn't come on board our ship unless we gave them, one of us, a white person, as a hostage on land. So that's when he starts to talk about Europeans as white and Africans as black, but then that kind of fades away. You can see that that doesn't take in his vocabulary. It's a new concept for him. For him, everything is about Christian or non-Christian, number one, and then Catholic or Protestant. Those are I think he mentions Jews twice. That was one of the references where he says the representatives, the Moors we met in Trarza look like Jews. We don't know what he says about that. He was in Curacao, which had a huge Jewish population when he was there, but he never mentions that either. So he's trying to get his head around this stuff, and he doesn't have a lot of categories to work with.
But there was a possibility that there was a multiplicity of religions, Muslim, Jew. They could have been Jewish. The Tatars, I think it's an area that also needs research. Who were with these Tatars? Like, did he distinguish them according to their skin color? Clearly, no. Was it because of the way they dressed? Was it because of how they did certain things? Why were they? What was a distinguishing factor between Tatars and Moors? You know, so that's a very curious area.
I mean, of course, there were Jews in early modern Mauritania, not necessarily on the coast, but rather in the oasis in the Sahara. Of course, there were Jewish communities who, at certain point, had also a certain role in trans-Saharan trade. But here, it's clearly on the coast. It's clearly Muslims. And the thing with the Tartars, I mean, Tartars in the early modern German language, it would be the Mongols, Genghis Khan. So what it means, it's the enemy. You know, it's an enemy marked by a strong alterity, which is also a religious alterity, and then is used also for Muslims. He has, as Craig said, he has very blurred ideas sometimes. He refers to the coast of Mauritania and the coast of Morocco as Turkey, just because its rule is under Muslim rule. He has clearly not precise ideas about
You don't want to discredit our Johann Peter Oettinger. Of course, being a barber surgeon involves no university training or written training of any kind. If you want to be a physician, you go to university. A barber surgeon, you learn as a craft. And Roberto and I did note and wonder for a long time, he gets to Suriname for the first time on the northern coast of South Africa. And he says very sagely, he says,
South America.
despite what people, the coast of South America, he says, despite what people think, Suriname is not an island. It is the mainland, and it probably stretches back as far as Turkey.
Oh, wow.
So you figure out how he's imagining a piece of South America, which is connected to Suriname, which somehow stretches around until it becomes Turkey. You know, he had to pass a surgeon's exam to be allowed to be a barber surgeon on a slaving vessel. He did not have to pass a geography exam, though. And Marty, what you point out is interesting. The thing that would be great would be to look at all the accounts that we have of people who went to Arguin and Mauritania in this period, because it's really a cultural overlay place. A lot of different Europeans stop there. It's where different kinds of Muslim cultures meet. It's
you have
Morocco.
People. You have the children of between the products between different people of who are coming together, and you know, the mixed people.
Yeah.
So wow, that's interesting. So we are only left with about 14 minutes. Is there one more question? Jack said, thank you for the book. It looks very interesting. Did our surgeon talk about African mediators they dealt with, especially little hands like crewmen who were in charge of the transshipment of slave men from land to the boat? Yes, I think this is great. Especially if you talk about the Kingdom of Weda, those cabusas. I think that would be Roberto.
Yes, there are these African brokers. In this case, it's not the crewmen from Côte d'Ivoire, Liberia, but it's rather Akan canoemen who are taken on board when they come from the Gold Coast. They recruit free Akan canoemen, take them on board and bring them with them to the Bight of Benin, and then they need them to actually go on to the coast of modern day Benin, because the populations of modern day Republic of Benin were rather using lagoons to fish, and they were not trained to go on with their canoes on the open ocean, which is very harsh in that region. So they had to take with them Akan canoemen who were actually trained to navigate the sea. And then of course you have also commercial brokers, people who are facilitating the contacts between African elites, African merchants, and European slave ships, also on a linguistic level. There are some hints on that behalf.
Yeah, I just wanted to show a map from our book that shows in a lot more detail. The underlined places are places where Oettinger went on land. So they anchor off of the Brandenburg slave trading fort here, Groß Friedrichsburg. And that's where they take on, or they enlist these canoemen that Roberto was talking about, somewhere here along the Gold Coast region, what is today Ghana. And then they need these canoemen when they come down here to the Kingdom of Hueda, where Oettinger spends significant time on land, where they purchase the vast majority of the enslaved people that they get. So this is really an area of kind of, you know, African cultural and technical exchange. It's the canoemen from over here that make it possible. You can't even anchor. Finn Fugelstad has written about this quite vividly. You can't even anchor a huge ship off the coast of the Kingdom of Hueda here, where I'm circling. There's no natural harbor. Oettinger is amazed by the surf. I mean, he's from deep inland Germany, where the largest body of water is like the Rhine River or something. So he is amazed by the surf, and so the ship stays anchored well offshore here. The canoemen ferry the European traders and the slave dealers in, and then they ferry the enslaved captives or shackled together back out. So they're utterly reliant on those men to be able to do anything at all in this area, to do any business at all. Who else does he talk about, Roberto, as far as middlemen? Or, I mean, Oettinger, so the actual court of King Anbagla is a couple miles inland. Roberto, how far did we conclude it was there?
I thought there was a picture that shows them being carried to the king of some.
Right.
This is the Labat engraving.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we have that. Do we have that in our? Did we use that in the book or not?
Yes.
Oh, we did. Oh, okay. Well, you can try to find that. But at any rate, so part of the work of like the little people in this world is that Oettinger and all the Europeans, they're carried on hammocks for miles inland from the beach to get to the court of King Anbagla, where they settle into these little houses that have been built for them, and they prepare to show their respects to the king, start their commercial dealing, et cetera, et cetera. So that's another aspect of African, I guess, labor, you would say, that is essential to what these guys are doing there.
I can share the screen.
Okay. So we'll do that within the next 2 minutes. Then I'll also need to share the screen.
You see it?
Ah, there it is.
Mm-hmm.
There it is.
So this is the court. This is actually taken from another travelogue. And this represents a big palace compound of the king of Hueda. And you see here on the bottom, you have soldiers and hammock carriers who are carrying the representatives of European slave trading companies to the royal palace.
Mm-hmm. So they had a really established trading relationship or business relationship, because they were treated as guests, given special treatment. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that they were given different housing. There was the Portuguese house, there was the French, the English, then the Great Palace. That's really, really interesting. And also how the complex is built as well. Though Oettinger being used to the European, more, because I realized that he describes the European cities or towns in detail and their architecture and how he loved the architecture. He describes how roughly the palace was built. But what interests me is he describes the 2-story, 3-story part of the compound as well. Yes. Whereas just in the narrative doesn't show that there were complex buildings like this, because for me this is complex enough for a palace.
The interesting thing is that this palace does not exist any longer. It was destroyed in 1727 when another kingdom, the kingdom of Dahomey, conquered the kingdom of Hueda, and they really destroyed the palace. So the hint that you highlighted on the 2-story structure in the palace is a very important one, because indeed not all, it was actually quite rare to have earthenworks palace structures in this region who were that high. Yeah.
And it was also a tropical environment, so
Of course.
that hints
You know,
a certain.
Oettinger's description of the king of Huayta and what he encounters there reminds me of one other reason why this story really stands out. We have other descriptions of West Africa and the slave trade from this period from captains of slaving ships, Captain Thomas Phillips, et cetera, et cetera. But Oettinger is a little bit different from all of these other accounts because Oettinger is a little bit lower down the social hierarchy than these merchants or slave ship captains. But he's high enough up so that he's literate and able to tell us what he thinks. If you go any higher than Oettinger on this hierarchy, the descriptions that you get are based on a sense that everything African is in many ways inferior to everything European, the people, the architecture, et cetera, et cetera. Oettinger is like that a little bit, but Oettinger is able to say things that these wealthy traders and ships captains are not able to say. He's here in the court of Huayta, and he says, well, you know, we've got our trade goods here, but people are always trying to steal from us. There's a lot of stealing going on. And you read that and you think, this is a typical account where a European says, Africans are thieves, they're morally inferior to us. And then Oettinger stops and he says, but you know what? It's just the same way in Europe. And the biggest thieves are the kings and rulers. And whether we're here in Huayta or back in Europe, if we wanted to hang all the thieves, we would have to start with the kings and the rich people. And this is a perspective that you don't get from other accounts, because this is a perspective where Oettinger is saying, I'm a little person, and I actually have a little bit in common with little people in other parts of the world. And we all know that the biggest thieves steal a little and they put you in jail, steal a lot and they make you king, right? He understands that old saying. And that's one of the ways that there's a little bit more to Oettinger than just a simple man who's totally complicit in the slave trade and participates in this brutality and destruction of life unthinkingly. There's a little bit more to him than that. And that really, to come back to your first question, is one of the things that I think got us excited about sharing his story with the rest of the world.
Wow. Thank you so much for that really beautiful, beautiful explanation about your book. So we are so excited about its launch. It's going to be launched on the 14th of December this year, in about a month. So it will be available first in the United States, then it will take a few weeks to be shipped to Europe. Then I don't know how long it's going to take us to receive it in Southern Africa, but I'll make sure that it happens faster than Europe.
Yeah, I'm going to just mail some over.
So this is the website, the Virginia Press website, where you can pre-order the book, and you can also just view the summary of what the book is all about.
Yeah.
If you...
Yeah, we're very happy with the way this is laid out. You can pre-order now. That will get the publisher very excited if there are pre-orders, and then they'll make plans to print more of them. And I guess we have a nice, that's our cover there. So we have a nice image of that. That's Oettinger right there, by the way. Not that he's the most important person in the story, but that's a picture of him. And you have the link and the other information. Of course, this book is also available on Amazon and every other imaginable place where books are sold. But just so you can see, the ebook and the hardbound are both available right here.
All right, great. So we also at Before Slavery, we have our website that I would like to share with you, and we'll be happy that you visit and check out our work and the projects that we are working on. So let me share my screen as well. It's taking a minute. All right, so this is our website. It's beforeslavery.com, and it's just beforeslavery.com. And we post educational material. We have our Facebook page by the same. Then on our website, you can see our lists of volunteers, our gallery of volunteers and contributors. We're going to add Roberto's and Craig's pictures there by their permission. So it's a diverse group of people who are really interested in investing and building the lost history or putting pieces of history together. Then we have our learning platform, and it also tells you what we are all about. So we encourage you to check out our website, then also subscribe so that we add you to our email lists. If we have any exhibitions coming out at any museums in the United States, we'll let you know. We have our newsletter be sent to you every once in a month. Then, as Ms. Pat said, this is a program that relies entirely on donations and goodwill of volunteers and people who are also passionate about putting pieces of history together. So would really appreciate any donation of any kind. It doesn't have to be monetary. As she said, you could be skill, it could be some research that you have done. It could be you want us to also talk about your book, as we have done with Craig and Roberto. That's fine. You email us and we will make those arrangements and see how we can work together. So, however, the monetary donations are very important to bring our artifacts to life, be able to purchase certain things that we need. And we have an AI project that we are working on as well that has been a little bit slow, but we are coming up with it, so that would also be really helpful. So just visit our website. Yeah.
Yes.
So I will now thank you everyone for attending. I'll now leave the floor to Ms. Pat to close for us.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for all that you have contributed to our event today. It was certainly very enjoyable, very
Thank you. Yeah.
eye-opening. And all of those who are interested in history, those who are interested in culture, the humanities, and just understanding one another, will greatly appreciate your book and all of your research. And we welcome everyone to, as Modesta has said, welcome everyone to visit our website and learn more about Before Slavery. And I hope that you will buy the book and support these professors and the work and the research that they've put into it. It takes years of dedication to do something like that. And we appreciate that they came and shared with us.
Thank you for organizing this.
Thank you so much.
After years of working on books, it's really a pleasure to have a conversation like this between Switzerland, Illinois, Georgia, South Africa. Thank you for your interest, really.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you. And thank you to the attendees. It wouldn't be a meeting without you all, a conference webinar. So thank you so much. Follow our Facebook page. Follow us, our professors, on academia.edu as well to see more of their research and other webinars that they will be facilitating or hosting in the next coming months.
Yes.
So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you all. I put this in.